In this video, we are going to be taking a look at GDP growth rates as well as discussing the concept of real GDP. But first, before we do either of those things, there's something I forgot to include in the last video that I meant to, which is GDP per capita. So GDP per capita is important because we need to take well, actually, first, let's talk about what GDP per capita is. So GDP per capita, anything per capita is just per person, essentially. And so when we are calculating GDP per capita, it is simply the GDP divided by the population. All right, so whatever the population is, divide the GDP by that, you got your GDP per capita. All right, the reason this is important is because if you are comparing different countries, right, and you don't take the population size into account, right, it can lead to misleading results, right? So there are a lot of countries with, so some of the kind of the big players, right? The U.S., China, India, although China and India very much well on their own as far as population goes, but that population size does have an impact on GDP, right? The more people you have, the more workers you have, the more productive you can be as a nation, right? And so you would expect a higher GDP, but that doesn't really tell you what the standard of living is, right? Which GDP per capita is not the best measure of that either, but it is better than just GDP on its own, right? Because when you take into account China's, 1 billion people, then their GDP looks kind of less impressive than it otherwise would, right? There are a lot of countries that get beat out by China, right, on the aspect of GDP, but not on GDP per capita. I probably should have checked this. I haven't, but I would bet money that China has a higher GDP than countries like Germany, England, France, so on and so forth, right? But I bet their GDP per capita is higher than China's, right? And part of what that reflects, right, those different standards of living, right? The standard of living in China, standard of living in Western Europe, right? Those are going to be different things, right? For the majority of the population, right? And so that's why we are interested in GDP per capita, right? So let's just look at a quick example. It's not a difficult calculation, but just so we can say that we did one. If we remember from the last video, our GDP for whole land in 2020 was 22,628.29, and we're going to say that the population was 127 people, right? Not a big country, also not a very wealthy country. That's an extremely low GDP, but this is a made-up example. And we don't really want to talk about stuff in the millions, all right? And so if we were to calculate our GDP per capita for whole land, we would take the 22,628.29, put that in our numerator, and divide by the population size, which is 127, and that is going to give us a GDP per capita of 178.18. So a productivity of on average $178.18 if this is in American currency, right? Which I guess I could cheat and say it's in whole land's currency and say that that's like $1 million and we're extremely productive. But given how much, given the goods that I put on our GDP table, I doubt that's the case. All right, but regardless, let's move on. That's GDP per capita, very important. definitely when you're comparing countries on the basis of GDP, it's something that you definitely want to look at as well, if not one of the first things you look at. All right, so now let's talk about the thing that I actually said we would talk about in this video, which are growth rates. All right, so we are not just interested, all right, or we're not just focused on what our GDP is and how big we can get it. Right, well, actually, we kind of are, but we also want to know what's the growth rate, right? Are we growing? All right, is the economy growing? Is the productive capacity of the economy growing, or is it stagnating, or is it kind of going down, right? And the way we're going to find that out is through growth rates. All right, so to calculate, all right, our GDP growth rate, it's not terribly complicated. I'm going to go ahead and say, so this is the GDP growth rate. All right, so we're going to take, well, actually, I'm going to just write it down, and then we'll talk about it. All right. So this is the formula, right? At least this is the way I like to write the formula, right? So GDP T minus GDP T minus 1 divided by GDP T minus 1 times 100. Right, so the T's, in the last video you might have noticed, or when I wrote the GDP for 2020 up here, I put a year right underneath where I've got these little subscripts, right? And these T's are just placeholders for the subscripts, right? So you just put in whatever year. If you were doing a 1 year growth rate, right? So the GDP growth rate from 1 year to the next, this is what it would look like. So you would put, for instance, 2000 here, right? Minus the GDP for 1999, right? T would be 2000, T minus 1 would be 1999, right? You don't have to do growth rates just from 1 year to the next. You could do it over more, right? But the point is you want to put the most recent year first, all right? Then subtract the earlier year, and then divide by that as well, and then multiply it by 100, right? Get it in a percentage. Right, but that's how we are going to calculate that GDP growth rate. Let's take a look at it in practice. All right, so once again, we're going to use that GDP for 2020 for Holland. That was 22,628.29. And then we're also going to use the GDP for 2019, which we won't go through the whole thing of calculating yet. We might see that table. We'll almost definitely see that table in a second. But when we do that, that's going to be $15,378.44. So those are our GDPs, right? If we're looking to see, right, what was the growth? How much did GDP in Holland grow from 2019 to 2020, right? We're also kind of assuming that, or kind of imagining this year is over, 2020, which probably a lot of us are doing, but let's carry on, all right? So if we're doing our GDP growth rate, all right, I might need to just do this down here because I don't think I'm gonna have enough room. All right, so we're gonna take in this case, our GDP subscript T, the most recent year, that's the 2020, right? So that's what I wanna put first up here. So $22,628.29. That was our GDP for 2020. Then we'll put in that GDP T minus 1, which in this case is 2019. So we're going to subtract 15,378.44 and then divide by that as well. And then we're going to multiply by 100% to get it into that percentage. All right, so once we punch all of this into our calculator, we are going to get a growth rate, and I'm just going to erase. Do I need that stuff? No, not really. All right. So once we punch that into our calculator, we're going to get a GDP growth rate of 47.14%. All right, again, this is just a simple made-up example by me. This is an insane growth rate. You are not going to see a growth rate like this. In some developing countries that had kind of more room to grow, you can see upwards of like 10% growth. But in a place like the U.S., it's going to be like 2 to 3% max. That's kind of where you get to when you've got a kind of industrialized society, at least for now, right? So that's a ridiculous number, but again, this is just an example. All right, but that is how you would calculate your GDP growth rate. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is the difference between what we call nominal and real GDP. All right, so what we have been calculating so far is nominal GDP. Nominal GDP is GDP unadjusted for inflation. All right, so that's what nominal GDP is. Any measure that is called nominal, that's what it's doing. All right, all that nominal means really, whether we're talking about nominal GDP or nominal prices or whatever, it just means that we haven't adjusted for inflation. All right, so nominal GDP, GDP unadjusted for inflation. All right. While that is fine in a lot of instances, right, it might not always be fine. Sometimes we might want to find the real GDP and probably figure it out based on the definition of nominal, but real GDP, kind of the opposite, and that is GDP adjusted for inflation. All right, so whenever you see a real measure, real GDP, real income, real prices, anything like that, what it's saying is that that measure has been adjusted for inflation. All right, so real GDP is just GDP adjusted for that inflation. All right, and probably obvious why we might want the real GDP. All right. If you're trying to compare, the productivity of the U.S. Today, all right, in kind of this time, and the productivity of the U.S. A long time ago, right, you're going to run into some problems because of inflation, right? Inflation matters, right? What cost 5 cents, 80 years ago, does not cost 5 cents anymore, right? I don't think. It's been a long time since I've seen anything that you could buy for 5 cents, all right? And so we would want to adjust for that to make that comparison more accurate, right? Because otherwise, those older GDPs are going to be much lower, right, than they really should be for an accurate comparison. And then they're still probably going to be lower even when you get the real numbers, but that difference is going to be overstated if we don't adjust for inflation. All right, so let's look at calculating real GDP. So how do we adjust for inflation? All right, so the way we're going to do this when we are calculating real GDP, all right, what we're essentially calculating is the real GDP for year X in Y dollars. All right, so we're not going to write this out most of the time, all right, but this is essentially what we're saying. All right, so kind of X, this is the year that we're calculating for, right? So if it was 2020, we're trying to get the real GDP for 2020, right? But real GDP has to be given in a base year. So we have to set a base year, right? We're going to use the prices from this year. So that in Y dollars, Y is our base year. Right? It's also the year whose prices, which it doesn't matter, right? Whose or which or whatever, right? Prices we're going to use, right? So when we're doing real GDP X in Y dollars, we're going to take the quantities from X, we're going to multiply them by the prices for Y, right? So essentially what we're doing when we're getting this real GDP is we're saying, if we had the same productivity, right, the same production level, we were making the same amount of these goods as we were this year, right, in the previous year or whatever year we're looking at, in our base year, right, what would our GDP be, right? So that way you can then compare it to other kind of real GDP calculations in the same base year, right, and make those comparisons. And so you're really just looking at how much growth you had in productivity capacities, right? And you're not just looking at differences in price, right? Because the year before this cost $1 less, so now your GDP is much higher, right? So let's take a look at this. So again, kind of X quantity, so whatever the year we're trying to find the GDP for, right? Those are the quantities, all right? We want to multiply them by the prices for the base year. So let's take a look at this. All right. So we are going to do, what did I do in my notes? All right, so we're going to do the real GDP of 2020 in 2019 dollars. All right, so most of the time what you would get with something like this is I would just give you two charts like we had at the end of the last video, and so then you could use them. I'm just going to write down the quantities and the prices that are relevant because otherwise we're probably going to run out of space. All right, so if we remember our 2020 quantities, all right, for steak. No, this is a terrible way of doing it. We're just gonna, I'll tell you what we're gonna do is I'm just gonna write the 2019 stuff, the whole kit and caboodle, and then we'll just reference, you should have the other table in your notes. I'm going to work off the assumption that that is indeed the truth. All right, so all the same stuff. All right, so we're not going to get too fancy with this, all right, but this is our 2019 kind of counting of the quantities and prices. All right, so if we're trying to get the real GDP for 2020 in 2019 dollars, all right, so I'm going to go ahead and write it all the way out so we can see that, but again, in future, might not necessarily do that. Might just write it as real GDP 2020. We'll probably have an understanding of what the base year is, or I will have said somewhere else the base year is blank. All right, but when we're doing the real GDP for 2020 and 2019 dollars, all right, we're going to take the quantities from 2020. All right, so this is the other table, not this one. All right, so really we can just ignore this line for this part of it, right? So we're going to take the quantities for the 2020. So for steak, there was 1,215 units, and then we're going to multiply that by the price for 2019. Right, so we're getting the value of the production, right? How much were the quantity of steaks that was produced in 2020? How much would that have been worth in 2019? Right, that's another way of putting that. Right, then we're going to add on, take the quantity of bread from 2020, so 6,728. Multiply it by the price of bread in 2019, so 0.63. Then we are going to add to that the quantity of potatoes in 2020, so 2,361. Right, multiply that by the price of potatoes in 2019, so 0.31. And then last but not least, we're going to take the quantity of beer in 2020, which was 10,175, and multiply it by the price of beer in 2019, which was 0.96. All right, once we have all of those pairs together, right, we're essentially done. The hardest part is just remembering to grab the right things, right? The calculation is really no more complicated than doing it for just the nominal GDP. All right, but once we plug all of that in, we are going to get a value of 18,650.85. All right, and so that would be our real GDP for 2020. All right, so the next thing that we're going to look at is what's known as the GDP Deflator. All right, so the GDP Deflator is one way that we can kind of look at changes in price levels. All right, so essentially looking at inflation. Let's see, why did I write it like that? Let's bring that down here. All right, so the GDP Deflator, this is just the ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP times 100. All right, so that's what our GDP deflator is. All right, so if we wanted to calculate the GDP deflator for the stuff that we've just been looking at, all right, we have both of those things that we need. We have a nominal GDP, so we have the nominal GDP for 2020. All right, that was 22,628.29. All right, we also have the real GDP. We just calculated it. All right, 18,650.85. All right, we're going to multiply that by 100, and we're going to get a GDP deflator of 121.33. All right, so what does this tell us? All right, looking at this, all right, with this 122.33, right, kind of let's just think about what it's telling us, right? In the numerator, we've got 2020 quantities with 2020 prices. In the numerator, we've got 2020 quantities with 2019 prices. So the only difference between these two is the prices, right? And so the difference, right, which we can see in this ratio, that's going to be an indicator of inflation, right? So subtract 100 from this 121.33, right? And you see how much more prices were, right? How much larger prices were in 2019 or in 2020 versus 2019, right? So based off of this, we can say prices were 21.33% higher in 2020 compared to 2019. All right, that's a conclusion that we can come to. All right, and again, that 21.33, all right, got that by subtracting 100 from this. We subtract 100 because that 100, of course, is just where they overlap. We only want to see, right, where the increase was, and that's where we got that 21.33%. Right, but that is our GDP deflator. All right. We've got one or two last things to do, and then we'll be on. I know this video is getting a little long, but I want us to go ahead and get all of this in. All right, so we have our GDP growth rate. We also have a real GDP growth rate. It's not really going to be that much different. It's going to look pretty similar. So it's the real GDP for time period t minus the real GDP for t minus 1 divided by the real GDP of t minus 1 times 100 as usual. Right. The big thing with this that we're going to have to remember, and it can be a little tricky to remember, is that real GDP t and real GDP t minus 1 must be in the same base year. Right, if they are not in the same base year, right, it ruins it. It's not going to tell you anything, right? So we have to have these in the same base year. Right, the good news is if you calculate the real GDP for one of these in the year of the other one that you're looking at the other year, right? Well, then that's all you have to do. You don't have to calculate two real GDPs, right? That is another mistake that some students make, is that they want to find the real GDP for 2020 and 2019, right? Like we just did, and then find the real GDP for 2019 in 2020 dollars, right? And use that, right? We don't want to do that, right? We want to make sure these are in the same base year. It's written as real GDP. That's partially because you don't, you never know which one you're gonna pick to do the real GDP for. But let's just do an example. Let's say that we want to find the real GDP growth rate, all right, from 2020 or from 2019 to 2020. All right, so essentially the same thing we've been doing. All right, well, we need to have real GDPs in the same base year to do that. All right, well, we have one real GDP. All right, we have the real GDP for 2020. All right, and that is 18,650.85. All right, this is in 2019 prices, right, or 2019 dollars, right? So we need to have the other thing, the other GDP we're calculating, all right, or using, to also be in 2019 dollars. All right, well, luckily for us, the nominal GDP for 2019 is also in 2019 dollars. All right, and that was 15,378.44. All right, So, right, these are both in 2019 dollars, so we can go ahead and calculate a real GDP growth rate. Right, kind of the idea here is that the nominal GDP for 2019 is the real GDP for 2019 in 2019 dollars. Right, it's a little confusing, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but the biggest thing is just they need to be calculated with the same base year, right? The same year's prices, so on and so forth, all right? So as long as we've got that, we're good to go. All right, so we do have these are both in 2019 dollars, right? So if we're looking for our real GDP growth rate, right, I'm gonna do the calculation down here. All right, so we're going to take our most recent year, so that's the real GDP for 2020, so 18,650.85. All right, we're going to subtract from that our GDP for 2019, 15,378.44, and then we're going to divide by that as well. And we will multiply by 100%. All right, so really, again, real GDP growth rate, basically the same as calculating a just plain nominal GDP growth rate, right? The process is not different. The process is just as simple, right? The real thing is just making sure that we've got these real GDPs and nominal GDPs in the same base year, right? So as long as they're in the same base year, we're looking at a real GDP growth rate. Right, but once we punch that into our calculator, we're going to get 21.28%. Right, that's pretty close to the GDP deflator. That's a coincidence. So they are not the same thing. They're not going to give you the same answer every time. All right, they didn't give us the same answer this time, but they are pretty close, which I was intrigued by. All right, but we can now see kind of, this also illustrates why we might want that real GDP growth rate. Right, when we were looking at the nominal growth rate for this very same kind of problem, right, we had a nominal growth rate of 47%. Right, once we adjusted for inflation and found the new growth rate, right, we saw that our real growth was actually a good bit lower than that, and it was at still a ludicrously high growth rate, but at a much lower compared to the previous one, right, at 21.28%. All right, this last thing I'm just going to say because that's really all we're going to do with it. Another thing that you'll sometimes might see is a real GDP growth rate per capita. The reason that this is done is it kind of gives a good idea of changes to standard of living, right, and takes population into account, right. If the real GDP growth per capita is going up, that's good. That means you're having a increasing standard of living, right? And the higher it is, the better as well, obviously, right? But some of those other things, if you're just looking at real GDP, you're not taking the population or population growth into effect, right? So you could have that you had some moderate economic growth in real terms, but you also had a kind of explosion population-wise, right? And so that could mean that your actually kind of standard of living is going down, right? So that's why sometimes you might want to check that real GDP growth per capita. All right, but that is it for this video. In the next one, we're going to be talking about a couple of ways to split up GDP. This is going to have kind of important implications for us later down the line in future chapters, but that is what we will be looking at in that video. We'll see you then.